Get out of here. Kids like you don't deserve to be on this plane. The words sliced through the sterile air of the terminal, spoken by a pilot, a professional entrusted with lives at 30,000 feet. But on this ordinary Tuesday morning at Gate 27, Captain Rachel Morrison did the unthinkable. She shoved two 11-year-old black children to the ground. They were not just any children. They were sick children, their medical alert bracelets catching the fluorescent light as their small bodies hit the cold airport floor. Their backpacks tumbled across the terminal, spilling insulin pens and glucose monitors while other passengers gasped in horror. Rachel stood over them, her voice dripping with contempt. "You shouldn't be traveling unaccompanied if you can't behave," she declared. The attack had started with the gate agent, then a flight attendant had joined in. Now, the pilot herself had decided that two 11-year-old children in the midst of a medical emergency were a threat. But across the terminal, a well-dressed black man in an expensive suit turned his head sharply at the commotion, his entire body going rigid. The airline staff had no idea who these children were. They had no idea who was watching. And they had absolutely no idea who their father was. The children were Zuri and Zion Peterson. They were 11-year-old twins, and they were fighting a battle most adults could never handle. Both had been born with severe type 1 diabetes. Every day of their young lives was a calculated dance of insulin injections, blood sugar levels, and the constant, quiet fear that a single mistake could send them into crisis. Small devices on their arms, continuous glucose monitors, beeped alerts when their blood sugar dropped too low or spiked too high. Their backpacks were mobile pharmacies, stocked with the glucose tablets, insulin pens, and medical supplies that kept them alive. On this particular Tuesday morning, they were doing more than just managing their diabetes. They were facing a new terror, flying alone for the very first time. Their destination was a specialized diabetes research center in Boston, where they'd been accepted into a groundbreaking trial for a new insulin pump system. It was a device that promised better control, fewer emergencies, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at a more normal life. Zuri was the protector. She spoke up, asked questions, and made sure her brother was okay every single moment. She checked his glucose monitor more often than her own, counted his carbs, and kept his supplies within reach. Zion was quieter, more observant. He watched the world with a careful gaze, noticing details others missed. While his sister fought their battles out loud, he fought his silently, with a strength that belied his small frame. 2 years prior, the twins had lost their mother to complications from a routine surgery. One day she was there, kissing them goodnight. The next, she was gone. Their father, James, was left to raise them alone. He threw himself into his work, not from a lack of love, but from a desperate abundance of it. The medical technology for two diabetic children was not cheap. The insulin, the monitors, the specialists, the emergency room visits, it all added up. So James worked relentlessly, building a future to secure them, even if it meant missing soccer games and parent-teacher conferences. Every late night, every business trip, every missed moment was for them. And so, Zuri and Zion sat at Gate 27, 2 hours before their flight, being exactly the responsible, careful, brave kids their parents had raised them to be. Zuri pulled out Zion's monitor to check his reading. Her heart sank. His blood sugar was dropping. It wasn't dangerous yet, but it was heading that way. With calm, practiced movements, she reached into her brother's backpack for the glucose tablets. This was their routine. This was their life. Zion looked nervous, but not about his blood sugar. He was nervous about the flight, about being so far from home without their dad, about navigating a new city all on their own. Zuri squeezed his hand and offered a reassuring smile. They could do this. They had been through worse. But someone was watching them. From behind the counter, a white gate agent named Todd Brennan fixed his eyes on the two black children sitting quietly near the gate. Todd had worked for Skyward Airlines for 8 years and considered himself vigilant, the kind of employee who caught problems before they started. And to Todd, two 11-year-old black kids sitting alone looked like a problem. He muttered to a colleague that children so young shouldn't fly alone, that something felt off. He decided he would handle it. At that moment, the pilot for Flight 447 to Boston was making her way through the terminal. Captain Rachel Morrison had 15 years with Skyward, thousands of flight hours, and an impeccable safety record she wore like armor. She prided herself on being no-nonsense, strictly by the book. She didn't tolerate disruptions or excuses. It was, she told herself, what made her a good pilot. But Rachel had another reputation, one not printed in her reviews. Passengers had complained of her coldness, her dismissiveness, the way she treated certain people with barely concealed contempt. The complaints never went anywhere. Her record was too perfect. She was convinced people were simply too sensitive. She had no idea that in a few short minutes her celebrated career would detonate. She had no idea her name would become synonymous with unchecked authority and implicit bias. And she certainly had no idea that the two children sitting quietly at gate 27 were about to change her life forever. Todd Brennan didn't walk toward the twins. He marched, a man on a mission to root out a threat. Zuri saw him coming and instinctively moved closer to her brother. She recognized that look, the suspicious, accusatory glare that had nothing to do with anything they'd actually done. He stopped directly in front of them, looming over their seats, and barked his demand. Tickets. Identification. Now. His tone was not professional. It was hostile, as if he'd already found them guilty. Zuri's hands trembled slightly as she pulled out their boarding passes and the unaccompanied minor paperwork their father had so carefully prepared. In a polite voice, she explained they were traveling to Boston for medical treatment. Todd snatched the documents from her hand and examined them with theatrical slowness, muttering about policies and procedures as if two small children posed some existential threat to the airline. And then it happened. Zion's glucose monitor began to alarm, a shrill, insistent sound that every diabetic dreads. It meant his blood sugar was dropping into the danger zone. Zuri turned to her brother and saw it in his face, the slight glaze in his eyes, the pallor of his skin, the small tremor in his hands. She reached into his backpack for the emergency glucose tablets that could bring him back from the edge. Before she could open the container, Todd snapped. "Stop making a scene." Zuri tried to explain, her voice still calm despite the panic rising in her chest. "My brother is diabetic. His blood sugar is dropping. I need to give him these tablets right now." Todd didn't care. He was still scrutinizing their papers as if decoding enemy intelligence. Other passengers were starting to stare. And then it got worse. A flight attendant, Amber Hutchins, walked up to Todd. "Are these two causing problems?" she asked, her words framing the children as objects, as obstacles. Zuri's voice cracked. "My brother is diabetic," she pleaded again. "His blood sugar is dropping. He needs his glucose tablets." Amber glanced at the beeping monitor, then at Zion, who was now visibly struggling. She said something that would haunt Zuri for years to come. They should have eaten before coming to the airport. As if type 1 diabetes was a matter of poor planning. Zion's condition worsened. His face was pale, almost gray. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He tried to speak, but the words came out slurred. Zuri's panic erupted into desperation. Her voice rose, no longer polite. She was begging these adults to let her help her brother before he lost consciousness. But all Todd heard was a young black girl raising her voice. He accused her of being aggressive and creating a disturbance. A few passengers could no longer stay silent. "Back off and let the girl help her brother," a woman's voice cut through the tension. A man stood up, calling the situation ridiculous, but Todd was committed. He pulled out his radio and called for security, reporting that two minors were being disruptive, and he suspected their travel documents might be fraudulent. Amber immediately backed him up, voicing professional concern about unaccompanied minors traveling without proper supervision. Zion slumped further in his chair, his eyes barely focusing, the monitor screaming its alarm. That's when Captain Rachel Morrison arrived. She saw the commotion, heard Amber's one-sided story of two unruly children, and made her decision. She approached the twins with the full authority of her uniform. "What is going on here?" Her voice was cold, commanding. Through tears streaming down her face, Zuri begged the pilot to understand, explaining that Zion's blood sugar was critically low. Rachel looked at the monitor. She saw the dangerously low reading. She saw the urgent alarm flashing on the screen. She saw an 11-year-old boy barely conscious in his seat. And she dismissed it all. "If you can't handle traveling without causing disruptions," she said, "you shouldn't be flying at all." Zion's eyes rolled back. His body went slack. As his sister watched in absolute terror, he slumped completely in his chair. Zuri screamed, a sound of pure desperation that silenced the terminal. She lunged for the glucose tablets, trying to reach her brother before it was too late. But Captain Morrison stepped into her path. Security needs to handle this first. As an 11-year-old boy was slipping away 3 feet from her, the pilot decided protocol mattered more than his life. Zuri tried to push past her, not violently, but with the desperate motion of a child trying to save her brother. Rachel grabbed Zuri's arm, hard enough to leave marks, and then she shoved them both. The twins fell backward. Their small bodies hit the ground hard. Zion's head cracked against the terminal floor with a sound that made passengers gasp. Insulin pens rolled across the floor. The glucose tablets spilled everywhere. And in that moment, at least a dozen passengers pulled out their phones and started recording. They captured everything. The children on the ground, the pilot standing over them without a flicker of remorse, and her immediate, confident lie to the arriving security guards. "They attacked me," she said in her most authoritative voice. "I acted in self-defense. These children are dangerous." But sometimes, when institutions fail, individuals step up. A young black woman named Essence Jackson had been sitting 3 gates down. She was a 26-year-old registered nurse. When she saw those children hit the ground, something inside her snapped. She didn't ask permission. She ran. Dropping to her knees beside Zion, her training took over. She checked his pulse, grabbed the scattered glucose tablets, and began administering them, tilting his head carefully and speaking in calm, steady tones. When Todd started to protest, Essence cut him off, her voice ringing across the gate. "I am a registered nurse," she announced. "This child is having a severe diabetic emergency. Someone call paramedics right now or this boy could die." The word "die" echoed through the terminal. Todd and Amber immediately tried to control the narrative backing up Rachel's story, but Essence whipped her head around and furiously contradicted them, telling everyone within earshot exactly what she had witnessed. Then other passengers started speaking up, confirming her account. The man who said it was disgusting. The young couple who said they had it all on video. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their quick, professional movements a stark contrast to the scene. After stabilizing Zion, one of them, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, looked at the adult standing by and asked a simple, damning question. Why didn't anyone help him sooner? Still on the ground where Rachel had shoved her, Zuri completely broke down. Through heaving sobs, she explained everything. How Todd had harassed them, how Amber had dismissed them, how the pilot had seen the alarm and still called them disruptive. Through it all, Captain Rachel Morrison stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of impassive self-righteousness. When a passenger asked if she had anything to say, she stated clearly, "I followed protocol for unruly passengers. I acted appropriately. If they can't handle air travel, that isn't my responsibility." Even with an 11-year-old boy being treated by paramedics at her feet, she couldn't admit she'd done anything wrong. The paramedics stabilized Zion enough for him to sit up. His blood sugar was slowly climbing back to a safer level, but he was disoriented. His head throbbed where it had hit the floor, and he was utterly terrified. Zuri crawled over to her brother and wrapped her arms around him. They clung to each other, a tiny island of safety in a world that had just proven how dangerous it could be. Then, with shaking hands, Zuri pulled out her phone and called the one person who could make this better. She called her father. The phone rang once, twice, before James Peterson's voice answered, warm and concerned. "Hey, sweetie, did you make it to the gate okay?" Zuri couldn't form words. A sob tore from her throat, a deep, broken sound that no 11-year-old should ever have to make. When she finally managed to speak, the words tumbled out through a torrent of tears. They weren't allowed on the plane. Zion's sugar had dropped. She tried to help him, but they wouldn't let her. The pilot pushed them, and Zion hit his head. Now there were paramedics, and she was scared, and she was so sorry. On the other end of the line, James Peterson's world stopped turning. Meanwhile, Essence had her own phone out. She had recorded part of the incident and had watched other passengers recording too. Someone airdropped her their video file, and Essence quickly combined the clips, wrote a caption that described exactly what had happened, and posted it to every social media platform she had. The caption was simple and devastating. Skyward Airline staff assaulted 2 diabetic children during a medical emergency. The gate agent and flight attendant prevented the girl from helping her dying brother. The pilot physically attacked them both. This is what racism looks like. Share this everywhere. She hit post and didn't think much more about it, her focus entirely on making sure Zion was okay. But that video was about to become a wildfire. Rachel Morrison, supremely confident that she had handled the situation correctly, boarded Flight 447 to begin her pre-flight preparations. She strode past the first-class cabin, past business class, and straight into the cockpit where her co-pilot was already running through checklists. She settled into her seat, put on her headset, and prepared for what she assumed would be a routine flight to Boston. She had no idea her life was already over. Back at Gate 27, Todd and Amber were trying very hard to avoid eye contact with the other passengers. People were staring at them with open disgust. Some were taking photos. Others were demanding their names, their employee numbers. Todd's radio kept crackling with calls from his supervisor asking what was happening. He gave vague, defensive answers, still trying to frame himself as the victim of unruly passengers. Amber retreated into the jet bridge, suddenly finding it critical to check boarding passes for a flight that wouldn't depart for another hour. And across the terminal, that well-dressed black man was now pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. His voice was low but intense as he spoke to someone on the other end, asking questions, demanding answers. His free hand was balled into a fist, and every few seconds his gaze would flick toward Gate 27, his expression one of pure, unadulterated fury. While all this was happening, Essence's video was spreading. First dozens of shares, then hundreds, then thousands. People were watching a pilot assault 2 children and feeling the same rage Essence had felt. They were commenting, tagging Skyward Airlines, demanding accountability. The algorithm took notice. Twitter's trending page, Instagram's Explore feed, TikTok's For You page. Within 15 minutes, millions of people were watching Zuri and Zion hit the ground. Skyward Airlines' social media accounts were flooded. Their customer service lines were ringing off the hook. Their corporate headquarters in Dallas was receiving hundreds of calls from angry customers, news outlets, and advocacy organizations. A senior executive named Patricia Sanders was in a meeting when her assistant burst in, telling her she needed to see something immediately. Patricia pulled up the video on her phone and the color drained from her face. She immediately canceled the rest of her day, got in her car, and started driving to the airport at speeds that should have gotten her pulled over. Patricia had been with Skyward for 12 years. She'd navigated PR nightmares before. But this was different. This was indefensible. She arrived at the airport and was directed to a medical room where the twins had been taken for observation. She walked in, saw 2 small children wrapped in blankets while a paramedic monitored Zion's vitals, and felt physically sick. Patricia introduced herself and immediately began apologizing. On behalf of Skyward Airlines, on behalf of the staff involved, she was so incredibly sorry for what they had experienced. But Zuri wasn't having it. She looked at the executive with suspicious, protective eyes and asked the question that cut through all the corporate speak. Why do you care now? You didn't care when we were on the floor. You didn't care when they wouldn't let me help my brother. Why does it matter now? Patricia didn't have a good answer, because the real answer was that millions of people had seen what happened, and now there would be consequences. She tried a different approach, explaining nervously that very important people were demanding immediate action, that the incident was being treated with the utmost seriousness at the highest levels of the company. Zuri just held her brother tighter and turned away. Meanwhile, Flight 447 had pushed back from the gate and was taxiing toward the runway. Rachel was going through her standard departure procedures, completely unaware of the firestorm erupting around her. Then her headset crackled with an urgent message from headquarters. Captain Morrison, you are to return to base immediately after landing in Boston. Do not take any return flights. Report directly to corporate offices. This is not optional. Rachel's hands paused on the controls. She asked for clarification, asked what this was about. The voice on the other end simply repeated the instructions and signed off. She turned to her co-pilot, a younger man named Derek, who'd flown with her a handful of times. Do you know anything about what's going on? Derek had his phone out during boarding. He'd seen the video, he'd watched his captain assault 2 children, and he'd felt his stomach turn. But he said nothing. He just shook his head and focused very intently on his instruments. Rachel felt the first flutter of genuine concern, but she pushed it down. She'd done everything by the book, she told herself. Whatever this was, it would be cleared up when she explained her side of the story. Back in the medical room, a door opened. James Peterson walked in, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was 6 feet tall, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His watch was subtle but clearly expensive. Everything about him screamed power, wealth, and success. But none of that mattered. His face was a mask of emotions that money couldn't hide: rage, heartbreak, guilt, fear. His eyes locked onto his children, and in 3 long strides he was across the room, dropping to his knees beside them. James Peterson was the CEO of Quantum Technologies, one of the fastest-growing tech companies in America. His company had developed breakthrough AI systems used by Fortune 500 companies worldwide. He employed over 5,000 people. His personal net worth was estimated at over $2 billion. He sat on the boards of 3 major corporations. He advised senators on technology policy. He'd been on the cover of Forbes, Time, and Fortune, and none of it, absolutely none of it, had protected his babies. His hands were shaking as he reached for them. Zuri and Zion threw themselves into his arms, and the 3 of them held each other as if they'd never let go. James kept repeating that he was sorry. Sorry he wasn't there. Sorry he couldn't protect them. Sorry they had to go through this alone. Zuri and Zion cried into their father's expensive suit, leaving tear stains and medical tape residue. And James didn't care. He just held his children and felt the full, crushing weight of what it meant to be a black parent in America. To do everything right. To have all the money and power in the world and still watch your children be brutalized because someone looked at them and saw a threat instead of babies who needed help. Patricia Sanders stood frozen in the corner. She'd known this was bad. She hadn't known who these children were. James Peterson. The James Peterson. Board member, major shareholder, one of the most powerful men in corporate America, and Skyward Airlines had just assaulted his children. Patricia felt her career flash before her eyes, but beneath that, she felt the profound shame of knowing her company had failed these kids in the most fundamental way imaginable. James finally pulled back slightly, his hands on his children's faces, checking them over, examining the spot on Zion's head where he'd hit the floor, looking at the marks on Zuri's arm where Rachel had grabbed her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, dangerously quiet. "Tell me everything, every single detail." He promised them that the people who did this would face consequences, not because of who he was, but because what they did was wrong. As Zuri began to recount the story, describing Todd's suspicion, Amber's dismissiveness, and Rachel's violence, James Peterson's expression hardened into something that would have terrified anyone who saw it. He pulled out his phone, made a call, and when the person on the other end answered, James said 6 words that would change everything. "Richard, we need to talk. Now." With his children still in his arms, James Peterson found the contact on his phone, his hand trembling with barely controlled rage. Richard Caldwell, CEO of Skyward Airlines, a name he'd called dozens of times for business matters, charity events, board meetings. The phone rang twice before Richard picked up, his voice cheerful and warm. "James, good to hear from you. How's the quarter looking for Quantum?" "Business as usual." Richard had no idea what was coming. James's voice, when he spoke, was colder than Richard had ever heard it. "Richard, your airline just assaulted my 11-year-old children." There was a beat of silence, the kind that hangs in the air when a brain is struggling to process words that make no sense. "I'm sorry. What?" And then James explained. In precise, controlled detail, he described what had happened at Gate 27, how a gate agent had harassed his children, how a flight attendant had dismissed a diabetic emergency, how one of Richard's pilots had physically shoved 2 sick kids to the ground during a medical crisis. He described watching video footage of his son's head hitting the terminal floor, of his daughter being grabbed and thrown like she was garbage. With each sentence, Richard Caldwell's tone changed. The cheerfulness vanished, replaced by creeping horror. By the time James finished speaking, Richard's voice was shaking. "James, my God. Where are they? Are they okay? Where are you?" James told him they were still at the airport, that Zion had been treated by paramedics, but they had missed their flight to Boston for a critical medical trial, that his children were traumatized and hurt, and asking him why those people hated them. And then James delivered the information that made Richard's blood run cold. "Richard, I've been on your board of directors for 3 years. I hold significant shares in this company. But right now, I'm not calling you as a board member. I'm calling you as a father whose children were nearly killed by your employees' racism and negligence." Richard was already moving, grabbing his keys, telling his assistant to cancel everything. He promised James immediate action, a full investigation, that the people responsible would be held accountable. James's response was ice. They better be. While Richard raced to his car, James made another call, this one to his head of legal counsel at Quantum Technologies. He gave instructions in that same cold, precise voice. Prepare lawsuits against Skyward Airlines and every staff member involved. He wanted charges filed, civil suits, criminal complaints if possible. He wanted their employment records, their training records, every passenger complaint ever filed against them. His legal team had heard James angry before, but never like this. Meanwhile, the video Essence posted was now a global phenomenon, over 5 million views and climbing. It was on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Local stations across the country were running the story. Pilot assaults diabetic children was trending nationwide. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements. Diabetes advocacy groups were demanding answers. The NAACP released a formal condemnation. Celebrities were sharing the video. Politicians were calling for investigations. Skyward Airlines' stock price had dropped 3% in the last hour, and Captain Rachel Morrison's flight was just touching down in Boston, completely unaware that her world had collapsed while she was in the air. She taxied to the gate, went through her standard shutdown procedures, and prepared to disembark. Before she could unbuckle, there was a knock on the cockpit door. 2 corporate security officers stood there, their expressions grim. "Captain Morrison, you're needed for an urgent meeting. We'll escort you." Rachel's confusion was curdling into real concern. "What is this about?" she asked. The officers exchanged a look and simply repeated that she needed to come with them immediately. As they walked her through the terminal, Rachel noticed people staring, pointing. She heard someone whisper, "That's her. That's the pilot from the video." What video? She was escorted into a stark professional conference room in the corporate offices adjacent to the airport, the kind of room where careers ended. She sat down, still in her pilot's uniform, still convinced that once she explained everything, this would all be resolved. She had no idea that 2 floors up, Todd Brennan was sitting alone under observation, or that in another room, Amber Hutchins was crying, asking what was happening. They'd been summoned and isolated separately, standard procedure for a serious investigation. Back at the first airport, Richard Caldwell's car screeched into the executive parking area. He'd made a 30-minute drive in 18. He found Patricia Sanders, who led him to the medical room. Richard was a tall, silver-haired man, usually confident and commanding. But when he walked in and saw 2 small children wrapped in blankets, one with a bandage on his head, both with tear-stained faces, he looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. He approached slowly, respectfully. He knelt down to their eye level and apologized. He told them directly that what happened was wrong, that his employees had failed them in the worst possible way, and that he was personally going to make sure there was accountability. Zuri looked at the powerful CEO and asked the same question she'd asked Patricia. "Why didn't anyone help us when we needed it?" Richard had no answer because the real answer, the one everyone in that room knew, was racism. The implicit bias that saw 2 black children as a threat instead of kids, in desperate need of help. James stood up, his hand resting protectively on Zion's shoulder. His voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. "Apologies aren't enough, Richard. My children could have died." Zion's blood sugar dropped to critical levels. He hit his head hard enough for paramedics to recommend a CT scan. "And your pilot not only watched it happen, she caused it." Richard nodded grimly. He understood. Justice would be served. 20 minutes later, Richard Caldwell walked into the conference room where Rachel Morrison was waiting. He wasn't alone. Susan Mills, Skyward's head of HR, was with him. So was the company's chief legal counsel, the kind of team that assembles when things are irreversibly bad. Rachel sat up straighter, her captain's authority kicking in. She was ready to defend her actions. Richard took a seat across from her. "Explain what happened at Gate 27, he said. "Your side of the story. No interruptions." And Rachel did. She described receiving information from Gate staff about 2 disruptive unaccompanied minors. She explained that when she arrived, their sister was being verbally aggressive with airline personnel. She stated that she'd assessed the situation and determined the passengers posed a safety risk. She described how the girl had physically pushed her and how she'd responded appropriately to neutralize the threat. Neutralize the threat. Those were her actual words, describing an 11-year-old girl trying to save her brother's life. Richard listened without expression. When she finished, he pulled out a tablet and set it on the table. He pressed play. The video started. Multiple angles, spliced together from passenger phones, crystal clear footage. There was Zion's glucose monitor beeping its urgent alarm, Zuri trying to give him glucose tablets, Todd demanding documents, Amber dismissing a medical emergency, and there was Rachel Morrison looking at a dying child and calling him disruptive. There she was, physically blocking Zuri, grabbing the little girl's arm hard enough to leave marks, shoving both children backward. There was Zion's head hitting the tile floor with a sickening crack. The video played in complete silence. Rachel's face went from defensive to confused to pale to absolutely bloodless. She was watching herself do things she'd convinced herself hadn't happened that way, hearing herself say things that sounded monstrous in replay. The video ended. Richard let the silence hang in the air. Then he spoke. "Captain Morrison, do you know whose children those are?" Rachel shook her head, her voice a hoarse whisper. "No, those are James Peterson's children." Rachel's brow furrowed. The name was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Richard's next words made her entire world implode. James Peterson, CEO of Quantum Technologies, member of the Skyward Airlines board of directors, one of the largest shareholders in this company, and one of the most powerful executives in the country. Rachel's eyes went wide. The blood that had drained from her face did not return. She stammered, offering weak excuses about not knowing, about not being informed, as if any of that could matter, as if the identity of the children's father had any bearing on the fundamental wrongness of assaulting them. Just then, the conference room door swung open. James Peterson entered. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. His very presence seemed to alter the gravity in the room, drawing all attention to him. He still wore his expensive suit, though the tie was now loosened. His eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion and grief, yet they were absolutely focused, holding a terrifying clarity. Rachel lurched to her feet, a clumsy attempt to apologize, to explain, to say something, anything. James simply held up one hand. The gesture was calm, almost gentle, but it had the force of a physical blow. Rachel fell silent, stopping mid-word as if a switch had been flipped inside her. James sat down. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke in a measured, controlled tone that was somehow more chilling than any scream could ever be. He described the feeling of a phone call tearing his world apart, his 11-year-old daughter on the line, her voice choked with sobs, crying that people had hurt her brother. He spoke of the raw panic in her voice, the gut-wrenching knowledge that his children were alone, scared, and injured, and he wasn't there to protect them. He told them about Zuri and Zion, about how they had lost their mother 2 years ago. He described how they'd been forced to grow up too fast, managing a serious medical condition with a maturity that shamed most adults. He spoke of their bravery, taking this trip alone because they so desperately wanted to get better. He painted a picture of watching the video, of seeing his babies, thrown to the ground by someone in a position of authority, someone they should have been able to trust. And then he locked his gaze onto Rachel's, and he asked her a single question. Would you have treated them that way if they were white? The silence that followed was deafening, a physical pressure in the room. Rachel's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. You could see the desperate urge to say yes, to defend herself, to claim that race had nothing to do with it. But the words wouldn't come. They couldn't, because everyone in that room, including Rachel herself, knew the answer. The silence was her confession. Richard spoke into the void. He asked to bring in the other staff members involved. Todd Brennan was brought in first. A separate interview, the same questions. Todd tried to bluster, to justify his actions. He said the twins looked suspicious, that children their age traveling alone raised red flags. He insisted he was just doing his job, just being vigilant. Richard calmly asked him to define suspicious. He asked what, specifically, about 2 children sitting quietly and checking their blood sugar was suspicious. Todd had no answer, or rather he had one, but he knew that any answer he gave would be an admission of his own deep-seated bias. Amber Hutchins was next. She cried through most of her interview, claiming she'd just been following Todd's lead, that she trusted the gate agent's assessment. She whimpered that she genuinely thought the children were being disruptive. When pressed about dismissing Zion's medical emergency, Amber claimed she hadn't understood the severity, that she thought the kids were exaggerating. Susan Mills asked a simple, devastating question. Did you think they were exaggerating because they were black children? Amber's tears stopped instantly. She too had no answer. Passenger statements were entered into the record. Multiple eyewitnesses. The detailed, timeline-perfect account from Essence Jackson, the nurse who had intervened. The evidence was irrefutable. The video was undeniable. The racism, though never explicitly stated by the perpetrators, was screaming from every action, every assumption, every catastrophic decision. Richard Caldwell stood up. His voice was formal now, official. Captain Rachel Morrison, effective immediately, you are terminated from Skyward Airlines for assault, gross negligence, and conduct unbecoming of a company representative. Security will escort you from the premises. A 15-year career erased in a single sentence. Rachel began to plead, talking about her perfect safety record, her years of service, her commendations. It was then that James Peterson spoke for the second and final time. My children will carry the trauma of what you did to them for far longer than 15 years, Captain Morrison. Your career is the least important thing that ended today. His words hung in the air like the strike of a gavel. Todd Brennan was terminated next, for discrimination, harassment of minors, and failing to assist children in medical distress. Amber Hutchins was terminated for the same reasons. All three tried to argue, to salvage something from the wreckage of their lives, but James Peterson rose to his feet, and his presence commanded silence one last time. He looked at each of them, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute judgment. You saw two black children and assumed they were dangerous. You saw a medical emergency and assumed they were faking. You saw an 11-year-old girl begging you to save her brother's life and assumed she was being aggressive. Your actions could have killed my son. He could have died on that airport floor while you stood there, convinced you were doing the right thing. He paused, letting the horror of his words sink in. I hope, when you think about why you lost your careers today, you're honest enough with yourselves to admit why you really saw my children as threats. Because everyone else in this room already knows. James turned and walked out of the conference room without another word. Rachel, Todd, and Amber were escorted from the building by security. Their badges were collected, their access revoked, their careers in aviation were over. Outside, news vans were already circling Skyward's corporate offices like vultures. The story was everywhere, and it was far from finished. Rachel Morrison walked out of the headquarters for the last time, flanked by security. Her pilot's uniform, once a symbol of authority and achievement, now felt like a cheap costume. Reporters shouted questions. Camera flashes exploded in her face. She kept her head down and said nothing. From separate exits, Todd Brennan and Amber Hutchins were walked out in the same humiliating parade. 3 careers vaporized. Their names were now permanently linked to racism and child abuse, a digital ghost that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But this story isn't really about them. Within hours, Skyward Airlines released a comprehensive public statement. It wasn't the usual corporate non-apology. It was a stunningly direct admission of systemic failure. The statement acknowledged that its employees had racially profiled 2 children, that they had failed to respond to a medical emergency, and that their training protocols had catastrophic gaps that allowed bias to override basic human decency. Richard Caldwell, looking as if he'd aged 5 years in a single day, announced immediate, sweeping reforms. Mandatory anti-bias training for every employee. New medical emergency protocols, especially for children traveling alone. Clear guidelines that medical needs supersede all other concerns. It was more than public relations. It was an acknowledgement that something was deeply broken, and fixing it would take more than firing 3 people. But before any of that, James Peterson had someone to thank. He found Essence Jackson still at the airport. She had missed her own flight to stay and give her statement, to make sure Zuri and Zion were okay. James approached the young woman who had done what trained professionals refused to do. He thanked her, not with corporate formality, but with the raw, trembling emotion of a grateful father. He told her she had saved Zion's life. Essence tried to brush it off, saying any nurse would have done the same, but James insisted. He asked about her career, her goals. She mentioned she was working toward her nurse practitioner license, but the cost was a challenge. Right there, in the middle of the terminal, James pulled out his phone. He made arrangements for quantum technologies to cover her entire continuing education, tuition, books, living expenses. His children were alive because of her. This was the least he could do. That day changed Essence's trajectory. She became a fierce advocate for diabetes awareness and for fighting discrimination in travel. She began speaking at conferences, using her story to teach others about implicit bias in medical care. Her voice inspired by two 11-year-olds who had needed an advocate when it mattered most. As for Zuri and Zion, they never took that commercial flight. Instead, James chartered a private medical plane, complete with a full medical staff. He flew with them, holding their hands, a constant, reassuring presence. The Diabetes Research Center in Boston was waiting. The trial for the new insulin pump system was a success, a revolutionary technology that monitored their blood sugar in real time. Their diabetes management improved dramatically. There were fewer emergencies, better control, and more freedom to just be kids. But James knew they had been lucky. Lucky he had the resources, the power, to demand accountability. Most families didn't have that. So, he established the Zuri and Zion Foundation, funded with a significant portion of his own wealth, to help families afford specialized medical travel and cutting-edge equipment. He didn't stop there. He used his position on multiple corporate boards to push for industry-wide change, advocating for policies that protected children with medical conditions, for training that addressed how racial bias so often twisted perception, turning a child in distress into a perceived threat. He made it his mission to ensure no other child would endure what his had. 6 months later, Zuri Peterson wrote a letter. Not a social media post, but an old-fashioned letter, which a major newspaper published on its front page. Her words were simple, and they were devastating. She described the terror of watching her brother dying while being physically restrained from helping him. She wrote about the confusion of being treated like a criminal for trying to save his life. She wrote about how scary it was to realize the adults who were supposed to protect you could be the ones who hurt you. She ended with a question that haunted everyone who read it. Why did they look at us and see something to be afraid of? We were just kids who needed help. The letter went viral, sparking conversations in schools, in homes, even in congressional hearings. Zion found his voice too. He began speaking at diabetes awareness events, sharing his story with other kids. He became a quiet symbol of resilience, the boy who had been knocked down but got back up to help others feel less afraid. The incident at Gate 27 became a case study used in medical schools and corporate training programs to illustrate the life-threatening consequences of unchecked prejudice. Rachel, Todd, and Amber became cautionary tales, examples of how good people can make monstrous decisions when bias clouds their judgment. A year after the incident, James Peterson sat for a television interview. The interviewer asked what he wanted people to take away from his family's ordeal. James was quiet for a moment. "My wealth shouldn't have been necessary for my children to receive basic compassion," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They were 11 years old. They were having a medical emergency. That should have been enough. The fact that I had to be a billionaire CEO for anyone to finally care. That's the problem we need to fix. Every child deserves to be seen as someone's precious baby, not as a threat. As a child who matters. My kids matter because they're kids, not because of who their father is." The final image of our story is a simple one. A sunny afternoon in the Peterson family's backyard. Zuri and Zion are playing basketball, laughing, trash-talking like siblings do. Their glucose monitors beep softly with healthy, stable readings. They are just kids being kids, healing. James watches them from the patio, a cup of coffee in his hand, something like peace on his face. Not because the hurt is gone, but because his children are alive. Because they are using what happened to them to make things better for others. Their medical alert bracelets catch the sunlight, glinting just as they did on that cold airport floor. But now they represent something different. Not a vulnerability for others to exploit, but a strength for the world to recognize and respect. He watches his children, and he makes a silent promise to keep fighting, to keep demanding that systems designed to harm be rebuilt to protect. Not just for Zuri and Zion, but for every child who deserves to move through the world without fear. If two 11-year-olds can survive what they survived and still choose hope, then the rest of us can do the work to make sure that hope is not misplaced. That's where the story ends, not with revenge, but with two children playing basketball, healthy and strong. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens one conversation at a time. One person choosing to see children as children, no matter the color of their skin. If you were moved by this story, please like, subscribe, and share it so that others can learn this lesson too. We'll see you in our next video.